Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. Today I'm going to be doing a deep read of Kate Wilhelm's The Plastic Abyss, which is the first novella in her collection of two novellas called Abyss. This novella is absolutely incredible. If you watched my review of this novella, you can see me stumble over my words while I try to describe what is going on here. It is not an easy book to talk about, but man, is it a worthy read. It is so weird and twisty and absolutely incredible. And that's what we're going to be going over today. Of course, this will include plot spoilers. So if you want to read this, it's a very quick read. There are a lot of copies on eBay for $5 to $6. Go grab yourself a copy and read along and come back and watch this video. Or if you just want to see what I have to say about it, go ahead and keep watching. So this novel opens with Dorothy sitting outside of a room where her husband Gary is pitching an idea, really a desire to get a patent on an invention. Not that he did, but that his company did. And his wife, who he has been practicing this speech on for weeks, is listening in to see how he's doing. And he's doing very well. So she decides basically to call it a night. She's not going to go back into the room. She was in there earlier playing the part of kind of the perfect housewife to this company, and now he is doing his pitch and she feels like he's doing a just fine job, so she decides to go down and look at the beach. Basically, they live right on the sea. She can just walk right down to the sea. So they're obviously doing very well. Gary works for an important company, we find out later. But right now, we just see her walk to the sea, and she starts staring out at the ocean. And the waves, as they come up, start to seem like walls to her. The way the light hits them, she's like, wow, that's really wild. They kind of look like walls. So she continues to stroll along, watching this kind of interesting illusion that the waves are playing in the darkness, where it kind of looks like they've become walls. And the light of the moon reflecting on the water even looks to her kind of like the floor of the hallway, like this golden path with the walls beside it. And she's thinking of her husband pitching this concept. And we get this important quote here, which is her imagining the speech he was giving, that Gary is giving her husband. Gentlemen, think of what I'm saying. This material can absorb 85% of all the radiant energy that strikes it, absorb it and turn it into electricity to be stored in self-contained batteries, starlight, sunlight, moonlight, artificial light, radio waves, you name it. With the additional research that a government contract will make possible, we hope to increase that capacity to plus 90%, but more polished, smoother. That was the first draft. Wouldn't that create an abyss, she had asked during dress rehearsal. Could, but we can project whatever we want, and that's what will be seen. Illusion, then. Another shade of reality. Don't go mystical on me, Dorothy. Reality doesn't come in shades or gradations. It is real or it isn't. This table is real. This house, you, I. A projected image is a real image. It's just the damn semantics that make that statement sound contradictory. But basically, the company has created this material that collects energy from everything around it. But it becomes an abyss. Basically, it traps almost everything in it, and kind of like a black hole, nothing really can get out of it, so it just becomes this darkness that you can stare into. But one of the things they realized is you can project things on it, and that's all that people will see, and that's becomes kind of a visual metaphor for the entirety of this book. It's very important. Also, this concept of her catching this analogy and saying, oh, you're creating holes in reality that you can project different realities on. She catches this analogy, and he's like, Now, don't get weird. It is what it is. Everything is exactly what it is. This dichotomy between these two characters becomes super important throughout this book. And we'll talk about that a lot more later. But anyway, she's walking on the beach thinking about these things. It was a great way to give us some quick exposition. So now we are caught up. Then she continues to look at the ocean and these walls and the floor made of the reflection of the moonlight, becoming this kind of golden trail, become more and more real to her as she's looking at them. And as these get more and more real, she walks into these hallways, into the ocean. And it's interesting because I instantly thought about Kate Chopin's novel The Awakening, which ends, spoiler alert, click ahead about 30 seconds if you don't want to hear the end of Kate Chopin's novel The Awakening, which ends with the main character walking into the ocean and taking her own life. And I was like, wow, is Kate Wilhelm going to end this or begin this novel where that one ends off? And I don't know how much of a fan Kate Wilhelm was of Kate Chopin. I have no idea, but I feel like in an interesting way, this novel starts where that novel ends, because so many of the themes in this novella are so similar to that one that it was really, really very interesting to me. So she walks into these hallways, and then suddenly she's walking around corners, and these hallways are very solid and very real to her that she's walking through. This is the bottom of page 4 of my copy. She was content to walk, thinking, if you stare into the abyss long enough, the abyss stares back. Nietzsche? But if they were projecting images on top of the abyss, could you see if anything stared back, or would it be a one-way view? No. Gradations in reality. Everything out there is a projection. Only I am real. Whose projection? So she starts to question kind of her own individuality, and there's this sense of trust lost after the text introduces this concept of an abyss with something projected on it. And of course, Kate Wilhelm is going to continuously throughout this novella connect the concept of that scientific experiment or scientific invention and the truth of the real world. It's really, really well done. But she's walking through these halls, and suddenly she kind of comes to herself, and she's on the beach again, and somebody says hi to her. And this person walks over and I think offers her a cigarette. He lights her a cigarette. Anyway, he walks with her for a while, and she realizes, she doesn't know who this person is. She's a little bit creeped out by him, but she realizes like she has no idea where she is. She's on the beach, but she doesn't have any idea where she is. So they're walking for a while, and then she sees her house and is super happy and thanks him and runs inside. But before she goes inside, she decides to rinse off her feet. And when she goes over to rinse off her feet, she hears a couple of people that have just left the meeting with her husband chatting. And they are saying, let's stall this for a while and wait for Brock. And they sound very conspiratorial. And she's like, ooh, what is going on with that? Is somebody like messing with my husband? And she goes back in the house. Everybody leaves. And she starts talking to her husband about this. They're up in the bedroom, or heading towards the bedroom. And her husband's like, you couldn't have heard anything. And she says, what are you talking about? And he says, you just woke up. You haven't been outside at all. And she's like, what are you talking about? I never went to bed. And he's like, yeah, you did. I saw you sleeping up here. And she's like, no, I was out on the beach. And he's like, that's impossible. You just had a very vivid dream. And she goes to the bed, and her side of the bed is mussed. She has, or something has been laying there. She can see the indent of the pillow on her head, and her book is set down like she'd been in bed. And this freaks her out. It confuses her, and she gets very mad at her husband, and her husband's confused but handles it in kind of a traditional 60s man style, where he's like, okay, this is nonsense. We're not going to deal with this. And she's like, don't play these kind of pranks on me. And he's like, I didn't play a prank. And they kind of go to bed angry. So the next morning, Dorothy gets up and she's still pissed that he was playing this practical joke on her. So she kind of gives him the cold shoulder a little bit in the morning, and then she decides, you know what, I'm just not going to talk about it again. It's over, it's done. And eventually her husband, I think, is talking to somebody on the phone, and they come in and start talking about a man named Mr. Davenport. So the way that Gary's company is set up is there's two people that really make all the major decisions in the company. Mr. Davenport is one of them, and he lives just up the beach from them. And Mr. Davenport is interesting. He's an older man who is obsessed with the concept that his grandfather was unjustly accused of treason, and he very much wants to prove that it was unjust, that his grandfather did not commit treason. And we never get more information about what the treason was or anything like that. But Gary is very angry because Mr. Davenport doesn't seem interested in this new product at all, this abyss creating energy stuff. He doesn't seem interested in that at all. He just seems interested in this party that he's planning that's going to be coming up in about a week, where he can focus on trying to prove his grandfather's innocence. And they discuss why Mr. Davenport would be so obsessed about this. And this is what Dorothy says. This is on the bottom of page 9. That's only half of it, Dorothy said. The half he understands and talks about. The other reasons, the ones he can't even put into words, are more to the point. He has to reenact the past to make it real. It's disconnected now, and things have to be tied together or we forget them. How can something be real if it isn't remembered? So by making it live again, even by proxy, the past will be realer. His place in the present will be firmer. There has to be a feeling of continuity. This is what I love about this novel. Not only does it do my favorite thing, and that is that whenever it can, it presents the weirdest, most interesting plot points possible. And this is a weird novella. But also, she really presents... This whole thing could be considered kind of a meditation on perception or consciousness, and we'll get into that later. But this philosophy is sprinkled throughout it, which I find really, really interesting. And this idea of how the past remains real, right? If the past is forgotten, it has no reality. It disappears, right? And one could argue, and Gary's about to, that it still happened. There's still a realness to it because the past did occur. But this kind of philosophical concept of how do we interact with the past? If nobody remembers the past, does it exist? It's like the tree falling in the forest and the sound. If there's nobody to perceive the sound, did the tree actually make a sound? And this is the same. If an event occurs and nobody remembers it, did the event really occur? And she's talking about this is how we give the past weight, by remembering it, by connecting it as a line from the beginning of time to us. That's how we know the past is real, right? Through all these connections. Gary responds, "Good God," Gary said. "The old man wants his family name cleared. It's as simple as that. Pride. Just don't go profound on me right now, okay?" Kate responds, this sort of mysticism is as simple as the mind of the most childish ancestor worshiper. It isn't especially profound. This is one of the ways we have of knowing our own reality, through our parents and their parents. Deliberately, Dorothy goaded him, still angry with him for the not-so-funny joke and his refusal to admit to it. She knew he didn't want her to talk. She was supposed to listen to him, or at best, to talk about what he wanted to hear. She realized with surprise her own interests had dwindled and dropped away since their marriage. That's drivel, and you know it. No, it really isn't. We keep heirlooms, other people's if not our own, antiques, name our children for grandparents, elect elaborate cenotaphs to prove we're real. Yes. Honey, just shut up, right? She grinned, but he was not amused, didn't even notice. The old man's cracked on the subject, okay? So we go along with him, play it his way. On Tuesday, he wants us to have dinner with him and meet the reincarnation of his grandfather. This reincarnation of his grandfather becomes important later. Through this conversation, she sets up the complication of her marriage, but also the two forces, the two concepts that this book considers and takes apart. And that is the kind of philosophical idea of perception and consciousness versus a kind of realist scientific point of view and how they clash. Gary's plan is that on this party, during this party, so Gary's idea is that when they attend the old man, Mr. Davenport's party trying to prove his grandfather's innocence, that afterwards they're going to use the stage to show off this new material. And they're going to project things onto the abyss that this material creates in a 10 by 10 foot square, I believe, in order to try to get the government interested in this so that they can get more money to continue working on it. I also love the concept that the marriage between these two is difficult in the sense that Gary kind of demands that she thinks that what is expressed by her fits in with his worldview, and that creates a friction between them throughout this entire novel. And I love the concept of that she brings up of the minute that she married him, she sees her own interests start to dwindle. And I'm not going to get into the whole concept of the differences between marriages now and marriages back in time. And there are absolutely great female science fiction writers, and I'm adding her to the bunch. She's incredible from what I've read so far. And I like reading science fiction that is just as twisty and turny as Philip K. Dick or Roger Zelazny can get, but from the perspective of a woman writer is really, really nice. I enjoyed that because it's a different point of view. And we really have so much of the male point of view in science fiction. It was really wonderful to read this novella that is centered on a female point of view. I really enjoyed it. So we learn a few things really quickly. Dorothy is Gary's second wife. His first wife, who we never meet. Oh, well, we kind of meet her. We see her in the novel. But he had a daughter with his first wife named Joanne, who is very important because she is coming that weekend to visit her dad. And she has had a hard time connecting with Dorothy. She's kind of jealous of Dorothy getting all this attention from her dad because the divorce has given her a lot less attention. And her dad is so obsessed with work that when she comes to visit him, he doesn't spend much time with her. And this weekend he says, well, I'm not going to have a lot of time. So if you want to do anything, if Joanne wants to do anything like sailing or anything, you go with her, he says to Dorothy. And Dorothy knows and understands that this is going to make Joanne very unhappy. And then the book does a really interesting thing. It changes point of view, and we're suddenly in Joanne's head, in Gary's daughter's head. And we really get an idea of how she feels. And she has a very complicated relationship with her mother. Her mother was dating for a while, and kind of just enjoying going out on the town and stuff. And whenever there's a scene where Joanne is looking at her mom and realizes that every inch of her is covered in something. She talks about her nylons and her shoes and her clothes and gloves and makeup covering her face and her hair really done. And she says that it seems to her like her mother is made out of plastic, and that she's the only one that's real. And we're starting to get even an echo in Joanne of this concept that she's the only one that seems real. I think they call it main character syndrome now. That's the negative term for it. But this concept of, when you leave your friends, when you aren't with them, or do they still exist, or are you the only person that exists in the world? I remember the first time I saw one of my teachers outside of school, it really sent my brain for a whirl there, because for some odd reason they only existed to me in the classroom. And of course that is a very childish thing. As we grow older, we begin to understand that others exist outside of us. But the younger you are, the harder of a concept that is to grab. And then of course babies are by definition the most selfish of human beings, that just demand. So she's a young woman who is having a hard time seeing people outside of herself, and she's having a very hard time connecting with people, and she feels like shit all the time about it, as a lot of teenagers do. I think that's just part of growing up, is battling that space between becoming an adult and understanding that everybody has their own unique consciousness and perception, and being a teenager where you're still only kind of focused on your own perception and your own consciousness. So she's there, and she's going out to see her dad, and her mom tells her very kindly and says, you can, if your dad hurts your feelings by not hanging out with you, which he'll probably do, you can turn to Dorothy. Dorothy seems like a good person. And Joanne's like, yeah, I have trouble with that, but I'm going to try. So they leave it at that. Then we switch to Gary's point of view. And he's talking with the other older man that runs the company, and the man's name is Hank. And Hank has one of these small towns built in his garage, like kind of Beetlejuice style. But he has taken this material, this abyss creating material, and he's put it on all the cars and all the houses, and is creating energy with it that makes the whole town run, which is absolutely awesome. I think that Hank is maybe the more scientist of them, but I don't think he's the only scientist. I don't know who invented this stuff. I don't know if it was Hank. When I reread this, which this is a book that feels like it would be really enjoyable as a reread, I'm going to really focus on who did what in this company. But he's trying to convince Hank that they need to show this material somehow to the government. He really wants to do that so that they can continue to explore it. Next, we are in a young man named Tony's point of view. And Tony is the young man that Davenport, he's the boss of the company that lives further up the beach from them. Davenport believes that Tony is the reincarnation of his grandfather. And he is forcing Tony to grow a beard because his grandfather had a beard. And Tony is like, this is weird, but it pays super well. It's the best paying job he's ever had, is just going along with this older guy's kind of delusion. He doesn't really feel like he is actually the reincarnation of his grandfather. But we're with Tony. Tony's hanging out with Davenport. Davenport goes out to swim, and while he's out there swimming, he sees Dorothy. And they walk back, and Dorothy seems a little bit strange, and Davenport is being very kind, and brings her back and tries to feed her breakfast, and she's like, no, I got to get to the airport to pick up Joanna today. And Davenport's like, look, I'll take you right home, just sit for a second, calm down. And Dorothy's kind of freaking out, but she looks at Tony and says, hey, didn't I meet you on the beach the other day? And Tony's like, I've never met you in my life. But she's thinking back to that time when her husband played the trick on her when she was out walking on the beach, and he said she was asleep in bed, and she met that person on the beach. Apparently, Tony looks a lot like that person that she met on the beach. So eventually, she starts kind of freaking out, and Davenport's like, all right, I'm going to take you home. And he takes her home. The next scene is Dorothy picking up Joanne at the airport. And we see right away that their relationship isn't great, but it's not the typical trope of, you're not my real mom, I hate you, and the mom just trying to connect to her. It is two people that actually seem to like each other, but don't know how to connect. Joanne is only 10 years younger than Dorothy. Gary married a younger woman when he married Dorothy. And these two women are trying to connect, but having a really hard time doing it. So Dorothy is like, hey, I know you wanted to go sailing, and it looks like your dad can't go with you. And Joanne's like, oh, I didn't really want to go sailing. It was just an excuse to come out here and try to see my dad. And she looks over at Dorothy and realizes that Dorothy was about to say, I'll go sailing with you. But now she can't really say that because Joanne just said, oh, I don't really care about that. So then Joanne feels terrible. And these two women just are aching, trying to be friends, but just can't be. So we cut to Joanne out snorkeling, and she meets Tony, and they hit it off and start chatting. And he says, oh, I met your mom the other morning. Yeah, she was here this morning and at this time. And Joanne says, that's impossible. She was picking me up at the airport at that time. And we realize that the moment that the Dorothy meeting Davenport on the beach and coming in and meeting Tony and her saying, didn't I meet you on the beach the other day? And Dorothy picking up Joanne at the airport happened at the exact same times. There's no way those two things could have occurred. It would make Dorothy be in two places at once. And the novel is now kicking on full gears. I love the concept of doubling. I don't know why this is so interesting to me. In the South Korean horror film Tale of Two Sisters, there is a lot of doubling where objects double. All of a sudden there's two of something that there was only one of before, and that is so interesting and so mysterious to me. And here we have a doppelganger, right? Two Dorothys doing two different things at the exact same time. Really interesting. Later, now we're jumping point of views like crazy, and it's not hard like crazy. She sticks pretty solidly with one person for a little while, and usually actually every time there's a marker telling you that the point of view has changed just by suddenly dropping the person's name whose point of view we're in now. But we're from Joanne's point of view, and Joanne sees this empty city in a kind of hallucination. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one spot. Right after Dorothy leaves Davenport and Tony's company, when Davenport goes to drive her home, Tony, who's trying to be a painter but having very bad luck with it, suddenly is struck with inspiration and draws or paints this cityscape and puts a young woman inside it by herself, and he realizes, oh, that's Dorothy. So anyway, Joanne has this hallucination, and later she describes it to Tony, and Tony's like, I painted that. And they're at this gathering at the house, at Dorothy's house with Gary, and he is trying still. He's having this meeting with these scientists, trying to push along the concept of getting this project into the government's hands. And he's meeting with the scientist, I think, that was one of the inventors of the material, and they're talking about, okay, here's how we're going to present this at the party thrown by Davenport. So they're planning all of that. And while they're planning that, Joanne has this hallucination and explains it to Tony. And Tony is like, oh, I have a painting I want you to see. And Dorothy comes out of the room where the scientists and Gary are meeting, and he's like, I'd like to show you as well. So they all go to Mr. Davenport's, and they look at the painting, and it freaks all of them out, because it's the same city Joanne saw, it's the same city that Dorothy saw, and now he's painted it. So it's the same city he saw. 3 people saw the same kind of hallucination, and it really starts to freak them out. But it gets even crazier because suddenly Dorothy's like, I don't like this painting. You guys are pulling a trick on me. She's afraid she's going crazy, or that people are tricking her. She's like, I'm calling home. So she calls the house, and they're all listening. They're holding the phone out so they can hear the little speaker, and they're all listening, and a woman answers, and it's Dorothy. And then the point of view cuts, and it's really brilliantly how it works, because of course Dorothy at Davenport's house is holding the phone, but then we cut to Dorothy at her own home, at her and Gary's home, holding the phone. And suddenly Gary's asking, who was that? And she said, I don't know. He says, it's 11 o'clock at night. And she's like, yeah, they hung up. So Tony and Joanne and Dorothy, who is over at Davenport's house, decide to come back, and they're terrified that they're going to meet this other Dorothy. And the phone scene was so incredible to me and so scary. It gave me goosebumps when I read it. It reminds me of a part in David Lynch's film Lost Highway, where there's this weird guy that's been creeping the narrator out. This is the part I remember most about this movie from seeing it in the theater. And he goes up to this weird guy and talks to him at the party, and the guy says, I'm at your house. I mean, he's literally standing there talking to him, and he says, I'm at your house. Call me. So he hands so the guy, I can't remember if he has a phone or if the guy gives him a phone, but he says, call me. And he dials his number and puts the phone up to his ear, and both of them start talking and saying the same thing. So there's one of this person at his house and one of them at the party. It was so creepy. I'm not explaining it well. But that's the same feeling I got from this book. I have no idea if David Lynch ever read this, but man, that is a creepy, creepy concept. If you called your house and you yourself picked up. Yeah, wild stuff. So once we cut to the point of view of the Dorothy that's at her own house, she walks around a bit. She's been in the party the whole time with Gary and the scientist, talking about how they're going to present the material to the people of this party. And then she goes up and she's like, maybe I'll go for a walk on the beach. And then she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And she goes up instead and decides to go to bed. So she goes to lay down in her bed. Meanwhile, the Dorothy that was with Tony and Joanne come back to Dorothy's house. And they all walk in together, and they're terrified that they're going to meet Dorothy. And Dorothy walks ahead of them a little bit and peeks into the study and sees her husband and the scientist talking, and then turns around and says, oh, why are you guys back so quick? And Joanne and Tony watch her switch. Like she becomes the Dorothy that was at the house the entire time, and they are terrified because she's suddenly talking to them like she never went with them and saw the painting. Really wild, scary stuff. And Tony's like, okay, I can't take this anymore. I need you to go get Gary and send him out to talk to me. And so Dorothy's like, Gary's really busy with trying to get this thing ready, but I'll bring him out. And Gary is a total ass to Tony. He just is like, man, get out of the house with this crap. What you're saying is completely ridiculous. None of it makes sense. Just stop. And then later they talk about it a little bit more, and finally Gary seems much nicer. And says, look, why don't you all come over at 4 o'clock tomorrow? We'll talk about this more. Something is obviously going on, and we have to figure out what is going on. So the next morning, Dorothy doesn't really want to talk about it. She's feeling uncomfortable. Gary is still fighting with them and is like, no, look, this is reality. There is an explanation for this. This is ridiculous. And anytime anybody presents something that is outside of his acceptable worldview, he almost throws a tantrum. Really interesting way they display the way that he kind of forces his worldview on those around him. It's beautifully done. He kind of treats her like a hysterical woman. Who is easily swayed. He decides Tony is the one that's putting all these ideas into her head, that she can't be possibly feeling or thinking these things, that Tony's just telling her what she should be feeling or thinking. It's a really interesting look at this couple's marriage. And another interesting thing about it is Dorothy really loves Gary. She understands who Gary is. And it's interesting to see the way that Dorothy still expresses love. Gary comes back and apologizes later, and he does this a lot. And one could seriously sit down, and I might get some gruff for this in the comments, but I'm going to say it anyway. This part of this, and it's not the main focus of this book at all, but part of this is a really interesting look from a female perspective of what the patriarchy looked like in marriage in the 60s. It's a point of view that I'm not used to seeing a lot of marriages of that time, and it's really very interesting. And then Davenport comes over, and Mr. Davenport has more status and is older than Gary. So Gary suddenly clams up and Davenport takes over, and this conversation is no longer about whether or not what's happening is possible, which is where Gary always turns it. He wants only to deal with logical, proven facts, which makes sense. He's a man that is rational. It's about rationality, but it's an interesting concept to say that in science, your brain does need to be flexible to try and, especially when you're inventing new things, to try and understand the way that things are going to work on the things around them. Just like we have to test medicine when it first comes out, right? I'm not a scientist, so if any of this is coming across hokey, I apologize. So they start to discuss, Davenport and Dorothy start to discuss the nature of reality. Now remember, we started with the image of this material that creates an abyss. And then Gary says we can project whatever we want onto this abyss, and then people only see the projection, not the abyss. And this was used throughout the novel so far as kind of a analogy or a metaphor of reality, that there's abyss under everybody and that they project what they want to be seen over this abyss. The mother of Joanne, the actual birth mother, she talks about how she covers every inch of her body with either makeup or clothes, and that she's covering up an abyss. Really, really fertile image that Kate Wilhelm presents here. It's absolutely incredible. But they take this a lot farther, because it's not just about perception of the self when alone and perception of the self when others. It's about perception in a much broader sense, or consciousness in a much broader sense. So of course, they bring in the concept, and they don't even bring this up. This is just what I link it to. They bring in the concept of Plato's cave, right? The idea that our consciousness or our perspective is all of us sitting in a cave and staring at the shadows of the reality of the real world on the walls of the cave. And that's how much we can really view reality. And I know this is a concept that conspiracy theorists and young philosophy majors and young English majors even love to grab on and say, okay, we understand the real world. We've been awoken in the Plato's cave sense. We've stood up and undone our shackles and walked out of the cave and view reality. I don't know if Plato was thinking of it in that aspect at all. I think the concept of thinking that you have gotten up and released your shackles and walked out of the cave is hubris. I don't think anybody has. We can't view, literally, we are by the shackles of our own perception. It is impossible for us to turn around and walk out of the cave. We can't do it. We're forced to stare at reality that way. And I think that Kate Wilhelm in this book is really talking about what it would mean if you actually could get up, drop your shackles, and walk away. And it is not just realizing whatever conspiracy theory you believe is true or whatever. It's so much bigger than that, both philosophically and scientifically. But Kate Wilhelm, their conversation, they don't present it as Plato's cave. I just use that because it's an analogy that a lot of us are familiar with. She presents it as a game of chess. And they do this really interesting stuff where they say, okay, what if... So the player can see beyond the board, right? The player knows it's a chess game. But the pieces... None of the pieces know that it is a chess game, right? And all their movements are controlled by the player. The pieces can't see beyond the chessboard. And what they were talking about is what happens when a piece is suddenly able to see beyond the chessboard. And they're inferring that all of us are pieces, right? Instead of being shackled in a cave and staring at the shadows of reality that are happening behind us, in Kate Wilhelm's analogy, we are all being controlled by actual players of games, but we're the pieces that are being moved around the board, and all of those pieces, all those movements feel like free will to us, but in reality, we are being controlled, and we cannot see the truth of the fate of those moves. And the science, the physics, are the rules of the game. And the players can see beyond the physics. But the board pieces that are being moved around can't see beyond the rules of the game, can't see beyond physics. Wild. My camera died, so I had to recharge it, so if the lighting has changed, I apologize. So while they're having this huge conversation, really it's between Dorothy and Mr. Davenport, Gary is sitting and listening, and suddenly the floor in front of his chair opens up into an abyss. And he's terrified. He is a very rational human being, and he can't handle this strange hallucination that he's seeing. And he kind of puts his foot into the abyss that's opened on his front room floor in front of him, hoping that he'll still feel the rug, but his foot kind of falls off into the abyss. And this terrifies him, so he closes his eyes and starts trying to reform the room, to project reality onto the room by remembering every little inch and section of it. And while that's happening, everybody hears a noise of somebody leaving the house, but they're all in the same room. So they jump up, and it's Tony and Joanne that leave first. Dorothy and I think Mr. Davenport leaves as well. Dorothy's worried about Gary, so she kind of helps him up, and he is happy to find that the abyss has gone away and that everything's normal again. But they run out and ask Joanne and Tony and Mr. Davenport what they saw, and they say that they saw another Dorothy and that she walked directly onto the ocean. She didn't swim out into the ocean. She was walking on the water, and they're all shocked and blown away. Gary, of course, can't accept this. He can't believe that there was another Dorothy walking on the water, and this is how he reacts. This is on page 63. A mass hallucination. Gary, explaining, his voice insistent, persuasive. Gary, not believing a word until he uttered it aloud, then believing it to be gospel. We say what we want to hear, not what others want to hear, and when it pleases us, we call it truth. Joanne, weeping, almost in her efforts to understand what she was saying, walked on water, not in it, on top of it, weeping, listening to her words, not believing them, afraid not to say them because she feared the denial of what she had seen, needed to believe what her eyes saw. I like this. This kind of seems like an early explanation for an echo chamber, Gary's reaction. That we say things until we hear what we like, and then we accept that as the truth because we like it. Confirmation bias, of course, in action. And this takes us to the final scenes of the book, which take place at Davenport's gathering. This is what the whole book has been moving towards. Davenport was going to have this gathering where he's going to prove the innocence of his grandfather, and Gary was hoping to use this as a way to finally sell this thing to the government. I'm sorry, there's one more thing I have to go back to. Gary has a conversation with Davenport earlier, and they discuss why Mr. Davenport is not interested in selling this to the government. And he talks about some plastic that he had made and that he put a patent in, and the government grabbed it up and it disappeared, and it's being used in all kinds of military applications, but he very much thought it was something that should be used for people, to make the lives of people better. And he's afraid this same thing is going to happen with the material, that the government is going to grab it up and use it for top secret stuff, and the people will not ever get the benefit of being able to use this for their houses. And he talks about this whole process where he's sent in a patent, and certain patents are taken by the government and said, okay, this is of military importance to the country, and the inventors are paid, but then the stuff never makes it to the people that it could help the most. So Gary wants to get that government money, and Mr. Davenport wants to make sure that it eventually gets to the people that can use it before the government swoops in. So they're kind of working at cross purposes. And we end up at Mr. Davenport's party. And in this party, he puts on a play. And of course, Tony is the main actor in the play. I think he's the only actor on stage. And he is portraying Mr. Davenport's grandfather. But the play goes strange. And I think it only goes strange for the people that have already been dealing with the weirdness of this book. Tony, who's playing this lead role, lives out thousands of possibilities in the moment of the play. he lives through aspects of the grandfather's life, of Mr. Davenport's grandfather's life. And times he's guilty, at times he's not guilty. He's born, he goes through his life, and Tony experiences every one of those as his actual life. It's really wild. And for Joanne and Dorothy watching it, they see all these weird, shifting, possible multiverse style lives play out on this stage. And then other people in the room react as if it's just kind of a normal play. And this isn't made completely clear in the book. I don't know if Gary has given up on selling this to the government, but the scientist that he was working with to kind of hijack the stage and do this presentation of the material goes on with it. He was either not told to stop, or Gary's just so kind of taken with all this craziness going on that he forgot. I don't know. But he goes on with it, and they present the material. And as Dorothy is walking out of the room, she hears Gary talking to a military person, and the military person's like, can you imagine if we made a plane out of this material and then projected the sky above the plane under the plane? It would basically make an invisible plane. So the military is hooked on this. They like this idea. It's really, really cool material. So it's probably going to disappear, unfortunately. And then Dorothy steps out onto the porch, and I'm going to read this paragraph. It's on the bottom of page 69. Sorry, really quickly before I read this. So the presentation of the material was all these shifting projections. So it was like girls dancing and a flute player, and then it went to other things and other things. Very realistic. So the people watching were kind of shocked to see all these like trees and stuff that they're obviously not stage sets. Like it looks like you're really in the forest. Whatever you project over this material seems absolutely real. She stepped outside on the porch. The breeze was strong now and fresh smelling. In her mind, she saw the stage again, the muslin curtains, which she pulled aside to reveal the dancing girls and the flute player. Another curtain, she pulled it aside, and the tree and the fishing boat and the building and automobile, all were cast aside. Then the rocket and the tank. She hesitated a moment, then added them to the discarded images. Blackness now to be filled in. Illusion, reality, illusion, layer on layer to be stripped away, and when the final reality rested alone with no more illusion, could man ever achieve that reality? She thought of it as a scale, a ladder with great open spaces between the rungs. The rungs were reality, the open spaces illusion to be filled in by the climber, and how he filled them in determined the next step. I love this concept of reality being the rungs of the ladder, and then as a person climbs, they project whatever illusion they want to see onto reality in between each rung of the ladder. Really wild, wild stuff. While Dorothy is standing there, she splits off. And one version of her walks down the stairs towards the beach, and the other one stays on the porch there. We end the novel with her new position in reality. The new player touched each of her pieces lovingly and watched them go their separate ways. She would try to make them see glimpses of the next step, and those who were ready for it would see and take the step, and she would try to see what her own next step was to be, and who her adversaries were. And one day, or year, or millennium, she would finally understand the goals and the reasons. There was time. She could wait and play out the present game and join in the new ones where they started. She would initiate her own games. There was time. So, in the end, Dorothy is able to separate and become a player. Instead of a piece on the board, she becomes a player. But one of her also remains to be a piece on the board. Really, really wild ending. This book does not ever explain why this happens to Dorothy. The way I connected it, and I assume that I think Kate Wilhelm hinted at this throughout the text, but I think that the creation of this material is what causes these things to happen in the novel, and that's never said directly, but I think that's the case. I think that's why Gary sees stuff slipping away from him, sees the abyss open on the floor, but he doesn't have the proper mindset to be able to do what Dorothy does and split and become a new player of the universe. Joanne also sees stuff, but doesn't become a new player of the universe either. Dorothy had the specific personality and way of thinking that made all of this possible. And I found that really interesting, that she was able to have a mind open enough that she could come at this in a scientific way, but at the same time be open enough to say, okay, stuff is happening, and if it's happening, it's got to be reality, so I have to work with this. It just kind of shows, in my opinion, and maybe this is what Kate Wilhelm was really trying to show, the kind of mind a scientist needs to have. You can't cling on to rationality so much that when science is presented that breaks your rationality, that you ignore science. You have to be completely open to what science does so that you can work with it and use it and learn from it and make it kind of become new fact, right? That's what science does. So this was an absolutely incredible read. I highly recommend it. I know I've said that a lot. Go out and get your copy on eBay while they're still there. I would love it if this book exploded. This is one of the best reads I've had in a long time. And I've only read half the book, the first novella in it, The Plastic Abyss. I am going to read Stranger in the House next, because I think that hopefully it'll be as good as this one. So, all right, that is it. I hope you enjoyed this deep read. If you liked it, please click like. And if you like this kind of content, please subscribe, because we'll be making a lot more of it in the future. Thanks so much for watching.